unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Sandra Matz, who is a professor at Columbia Business School, also the director of the Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance. So we'll have to learn all about that. And also the author of this book called Mindmasters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior. Welcome, Sandra.
Thanks so much for having me, Greg.
So look, I think your work and this book, they combine two areas of research. One is that, I guess personality studies, right? The psychology of personality. And then also, big data and analytics. And of course, the two are combined, most famously in the Cambridge Analytica case, but also in, marketing more generally when it comes to figuring out how to personalize ads, personalize appeals, personalize outreach and so forth for not just consumer products, but also for voting and other things, maybe even dating, I guess. Anytime there's an effort to reach out to people. And I think the example, the metaphor that you start with in the book is actually a metaphor that I've used in my class, where you compare the kind of personalized treatment that, say, a merchant could provide to our grandparents back in the villages, in which they operated, where the merchant really knew the customer well, they knew their family, they knew their preferences and so forth. And then we kind of went through this dark age where, you just walk into the Costco and they don't know who you are. And now...
And that's still true. You still walk into a Costco and they don't know who you are.
Right. But when we have online and digital sales, right, with Amazon and so forth, I mean, it's, in a way, it's kind of like going back to that village. But of course, it's very, very different. So I think maybe we're going to talk about both the bright side and the dark side of psychological targeting. But maybe the big question I might start with is, why do we need to actually have psychological profiles as sort of a intermediate characteristic if we're interested in doing data-driven personalization, right? So if you think about the Target example, which everyone talks about back in 2012, all we need to know is that, if you exhibit these behaviors, you are likely to buy diapers. Like, we don't need to actually have pregnancy in there as an intermediate category. So what is it about, like, understanding people's personality, which enables you to do so much more than you would do without it as a construct?
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great question, right? Because what you're getting at is, traditionally, if you think about behaviorist approaches, is saying, well, I can just look at everything that you've done in the past, and then I make a prediction about what you're going to do in the future. And why would we collapse this complexity into like these 5 dimensions of the big 5 personality traits, or your personal values, or something like political ideology, gender, you name it. And I think it's a legitimate concern when you're thinking merely about prediction. Right? I think about the ability of data in the first place is prediction, is like, what is it that people are going to do in the future? And if that's the only business that you're in, then there's oftentimes, and there's exceptions and I can get into them in a second, no need to necessarily have something in the middle. Because the middle, you rightfully point out, is it just kind of introduces error in 2 places. The first one is I get from your data to something like psychological traits, there's error, and it's like a reduction in complexity. And then there's like, you go from personality to future behavior, so there's additional error. Now, what I think psychology offers is an additional layer of understanding that you don't get with pure prediction. So this is like the why. Why is someone interested in buying insurance? Is it because they're extremely anxious about the future? Is it because they're extremely organized and they just want to get ahead of the game? Is it because they're extremely caring for other people? So they're not even doing it for themselves, they're doing it for other people. And for me, the same way that you described these offline interactions, that we're not just trying to get at, well, what is someone going to do next? But also, how do I build this genuine relationship where I try to understand where are you coming from? How do I talk to you? Why are you trying to do a certain thing that I can predict from a just purely predictive point of view? That I think is where psychology really shines. And it shines mostly because there's still humans in the loop at many of these stages, right? So if you think about marketing, I can predict what you're going to buy next. And I can maybe optimize to some extent of like, here's the visuals that I'm going to show you. But if you want to have creative, like content, right, that could be anything from like messaging and advertising to content on a website. Most of the time, and we're going to get to the point where we talk about LLMs that can automate some of this stuff, is you still have a human in the loop. So that human is not going to be able to interpret a million behavioral dimensions that a computer and algorithm uses to predict behavior, right? What they can work with is some of these psychological constructs that we can make sense of as humans. So for me, kind of adding psychology gives you this deeper understanding of why people might behave in a certain way, given the same behavior that we observe, and also gives you a way of customizing communication in a way that's still somewhat difficult to do on a purely behavioral level.
So it gives you kind of a framework that allows you to be more targeted in your experimentation, right? So, for instance, I talk often about how, Netflix uses collaborative filtering to figure out, which movies to recommend. But then when they come up with these promotional ads, right, then they target very specifically. So, if you are someone who loves horror films and, you are somebody who is empathetic or whatever, they might create this ad for you. And if they did it randomly and they just spun up like an infinite number of ads, like they would never have to scroll through so many to figure out which ones work on you, right? And you did a lot of this when was it in grad school that you did these experiments on detergent sales and so forth?
I think ever since grad school. So in grad school, I was mostly focused on consumer marketing, just because that was the industry that was the most excited about this work, right? So you can imagine that for marketing professionals, I think they very early understood that the more you can understand about people, the better you can actually become at creating content that's not just predicting the next purchase. And since then, I've moved through kind of various different disciplines, all the way from helping people save more, building habits, mental health. So I think of it as the technology, as you mentioned in the beginning. It's very broad, right? Can I understand the psychology of the person who's on the other side, and can I tap into these motivations, needs, and preferences? And you can use it in consumer products. You can use it also in many other different contexts.
Well, what I was surprised by is the magnitude of the impact, right? So in those early studies that you did for, just selling detergent or whatever, I mean, you were able to get like
Beauty products, not detergent, but yes.
right. That's right.
Close.
The beauty product. It was like a 50% bump. I mean, it was crazy, right?
In a very, very crude way of setting up the experiment intervention. So back in the day, both the way that we targeted women in this case, so we tried to essentially get women to buy beauty products from an online retailer agnostic to the specific products. And the way that we targeted extroverts and introverts in this case was by using existing platforms. So Facebook allows you to target based on interests. And because we knew from other empirical research that certain interests are associated with extroversion, like let's say partying, kind of socializing, some of these kind of cultural icons that are kind of a lot more outgoing and social than let's say fantasy series. So we just kind of had this very crude way of saying, if you happen to be interested in one of these things, you fall into an extroverted bucket. If you're interested in something else, you fall into an introverted bucket. So extremely crude. And the same is true for the extent that we customize. So we only customized the ad that women saw on Facebook. Once they went to the website, it looked the same for everybody. And you're right in that the 50% uptake that we saw for the customized ones as opposed to non-customized ones was actually way bigger than we had expected. The one thing that I'm currently thinking about a lot in this space is essentially to what extent is this almost like a problem of the global commons, right? You can imagine that if you're the one beauty retailer that taps into someone's extroversion level, that's going to give you a bump because you feel like, oh, this is actually speaking to my needs as an individual, and you kind of totally got me. I'm going to buy. Now, if all of the beauty retailers suddenly follow the same approach, it's going to be ridiculously boring and you're not going to be able to stand out as much anymore. Then it becomes just a nuisance because everything is customized according to this like one specific trait. So it's something that I don't think we've explored much yet. But you could imagine that there's a benefit of you being the one retailer to do that. If everybody is doing the same, think of the future of digital twins or whatnot, it might actually lose its impact and effect.
But won't they just then get ever more granular, right? So, maybe you start with the big five color palette and then you start, getting down into, aquamarine and puce green and so forth, right? As you find those ever more precise keys that target those ever more precise locks in humans'
I think
personalities.
my concern is that as we outsource more and more to these artificial agents, right, that in a way learn who we are and replicate our preferences and choices, is that the way that they're trained is if you take an LLM, like a large language model, and you train it on your personal data, it's gonna recommend the most likely thing that you like. So it over time should actually make you narrow and narrow and shallow in your preferences, and then like the companies trying to break out of that a little bit is not necessarily going to make them more effective unless there's something that you bake into your digital twin that says, I want you to actually discover around my normal distribution, right? Don't make me too narrow. I want you to explore this aquamarine and maybe like a little bit of a shade of green, because it's like it's not too far, it's not in my typical kind of set of choices, but I want you to go a little bit outside and maybe help me guide you to these places. So I think it's like a, to me, fascinating topic, because there's something nice about having these algorithms understand what we want, but I also do think that there's the risk of us just becoming really boring.
Yeah. Well, presumably the people who are open-minded, you know, might might welcome it more than others. But I guess, I mean, going back to the big five, right? I remember, learning from my colleagues in organizational behavior here at Berkeley that this was probably the only validated kind of personality inventory out there, and that Myers-Briggs and all these others, which are used by business schools, right, to evaluate personalities, that they are, lacking in scientific validity. I mean, what is the current state of personality research?
Yeah. So I think it depends on how you define personality. So if you think of personality traits purely as the big five, the ones that are measured in a lot of these inventories, or like trying to be measured by the Myers-Briggs, for example, then you're absolutely right. Is like the big five, and some of the more scientific questionnaires are really getting around some of the pitfalls that you get when you try to simplify profiles, right? So the Myers-Briggs essentially gives you a four-letter label, which people love because it's simple and they can latch onto and they can make it part of their core identity. The problem is that essentially, because you're dichotomizing a continuous variable, right? If you take extroversion, most people are going to be somewhere in the middle. And there's like a few people who are extremely introverted, extremely extroverted. If you split that in the middle, there's a lot of error. So we know that for about 50% of people, when they take the Myers-Briggs on day one and they take it again 3 months after, they don't get the same label, because they're just like now kind of responded slightly different to the questions, maybe slightly different situational context. And now suddenly the label that they thought was core to the identity changes. That's why a lot of these questionnaires that you have out there, which people enjoy because they're simple, are actually doing them somewhat of a disservice because they're not as accurate. And the big five is really thinking about this in a five-dimensional space. It's still like it's still a very pragmatic framework of thinking about individual differences, right? Five traits, they explain behavior across a whole range of situations, all the way from like preferences, vocational interests, music preferences, life satisfaction, and so on. But still, I think of it as they're helpful if you meet a stranger on the street, right? If you meet someone that you don't know anything about, knowing that they're extroverted gives you a sense of how they might behave, how you might want to interact with them. The moment that you get to know someone deeper, like your spouse, you don't necessarily think about them in terms of the big five personality traits, because you have like so much more nuance. And still, sometimes it can be helpful. And I think the same way is true for like some of the customization that you spoke about in the beginning, right? Right now, it's still humans creating this content, and there's probably something helpful that to simplify the way that we think about customers. Um, We don't know if that's the same for large language models, for example, who can now also create this content. So we know that large language models are extremely good if I give them the instructions to create an iPhone ad for someone who's extroverted. The content is kind of amazing. Like it's as good as like creative teams. Maybe you can tweak it here and there to make it even better, but it's doing a pretty remarkable job. But you could also argue, like, why don't I give it access to all of Greg's data, and see what it comes up with? And I don't know. This is like something that we're currently exploring in my team. Is I'm not sure if I would which one I would expect to be better, because technically getting access to all of your data should give it a lot more complexity. But it also doesn't focus its attention. So it could be that the LLM just latches onto like a specific behavior arbitrarily and then gets into this rabbit hole. And from your perspective, it's just like this tiny piece of your identity, and maybe feels even really creepy because like, why is it picking up on that one? And like, why does it go so deep? As opposed to focusing the attention of the LLM onto something that's slightly broader, but also gives it access to decades of research exploring some of the big five. So I think it's an interesting experimental test, really, to see, is it better to go with the full complexity, forget about the big five, right? Or should we still stick to the big five, ideally valid versions? But then there's also other constructs. So big five is one. There's other validated ones that kind of tie to your personal values, which is used in politics all the time. If you think about health context, there's something like promotion versus prevention. So to what extent are you trying to achieve better outcomes as opposed to just preventing bad outcomes? Those would all still qualify as, I would say, personality traits, even though they're not the big five specifically.
Now, with respect to Big Five, I mean, one of the great things about reading books like yours is that, I encounter all of these things which I knew, but I have sort of source amnesia, like because I'm no longer, a grad student, and I'm no longer publishing. Like, I don't always remember who did what research, but maybe I was channeling you and quoting you when I say in class that, Google and Facebook know you better than your spouse and better than your mother. Now, is that simply because they're measuring your understanding of the big five, and spouses and mothers don't really know, they don't look at the world through that lens? I mean, is there any evidence that, say, Google and Facebook are capable of being more persuasive than your spouse and parents when it comes to convincing you to buy stuff, for instance?
I think it's a great question. So this is actually a study that was done by one of my colleagues at Cambridge, and she asked the question of like, how do we quantify how good a computer is at predicting your personality traits? And she essentially said, why don't we compare it to people who should know us pretty well? So that included coworkers, friends, spouses, and family members. And she only focused on Facebook likes and showed that with access to your Facebook likes, a computer was already better than everybody except for the spouse. Fast forward to better models, more data, they would probably also, at least in some instances, well, I'm not sure if it goes up or down. So maybe it's like a curvilinear. It goes up, and then at some point it goes down. But I think that there's multiple potential explanations for why that's the case. One is that obviously an algorithm just sees a lot more. So if an algorithm has access to the footprints of thousands, if not millions of people, it just sees a lot in terms of how people's behavior. And some of these relationships are even it's counterintuitive or like not as intuitive for a psychologist. I remember one of the findings was if you use first-person pronouns more than usual, it's like not a sign of narcissism, but a sign of emotional distress. So it could be that the algorithms are just able to pick up on stuff that we overlook as humans. The other one is that for humans, we also have oftentimes have incentives and motivations to think about and see people in a certain light, right? If I think of my spouse, I probably think of him as really nice. Maybe he thinks of me as a bit less neurotic than I am. So we have like this motivated reasoning going on behind the interpretations of people in our environment. And maybe that's something that these algorithms don't have. There's also something to be said of like maybe the people in our environment, they see stuff that we as individuals don't even see, right? So maybe the algorithm is just closer to what we put out there as opposed to the people in our environment. Maybe they're actually more accurate. It's just that an algorithm is better as representing how you think of yourself. So there's many different potential explanations, and I haven't seen much research on trying to disentangle those.
Yeah. Now, of course, there's in real life, there's impression management, right? Where you're trying to make people think that you have certain characteristics. And when you're interacting online, oftentimes you will engage in impression management. And so in economics, we always talk about revealed preferences versus stated preferences. So to what extent can companies like Facebook and Google um, collect these digital breadcrumbs and get a better sense of your true personality as opposed to your presented personality?
It's such a great question. And to me, it actually expands beyond social media profiles, right? So it's certainly true that on social media, we all idealize ourselves a little bit, right? We're all a little bit less neurotic. We're all a little bit more social. We're all a little bit healthier than we usually are. The first thing that happens is usually it's a parallel shift. So it's quite unlikely that the person who's extremely neurotic suddenly overtakes someone who's extremely emotionally stable. So for algorithms, some of that self-idealization isn't even that much of an issue because we're at the end of the day ranking people and we say, well, Greg is more extroverted than Sandra, even if both of us just kind of pretend to be a little bit more extroverted or a little bit
Right.
less
So,
neurotic.
so it's just like everybody inflates certain
Yeah,
dimensions.
in the same direction most of the time. So that's why it doesn't shift the rank order. Um, and the other one is that it's such a small piece of the entire puzzle, right? So Facebook obviously collects the stuff that you intentionally put out there, but they also collect every single kind of keystroke that you put. So they have the messages that you wrote and you deleted. They have like you hovering over one of the ads, or they hover like how much you hovered over a picture. That's not intentional. You don't put that intentionally out there. The same is true for most of your other traces that you leave. So if you think about your phone, being in your pocket pretty much 24/7, capturing everything from where you go, who you meet, because that's phones showing up in the same location at the same time, to browsing histories, credit card swipes, and many of the traces that we leave, we don't intentionally put out there. So one of my favorite examples is like the one of the traits that we know where people engage in a lot of this self-enhancement impression management is conscientiousness. So this is the extent to which you're organized, reliable, dependable. Most people want to be seen as somewhat more conscientious, especially in the context like job interviews where that matters, right? You're probably not going to say yes to the statement, I make a mess of things when you're applying for a job, because you understand that that's not what the other side wants to hear. But there's so many traces that will give that away without you even realizing. If your phone is constantly running out of battery, it's one of these indications that you're probably not as conscientious. If you're at the deli 3 times a day because you can't plan ahead for the next meal in your shopping, that's probably a sign that you're not as conscientious. So this is like much, much harder to manage, right? If you, and I'm just saying this because it's essentially my life. So if I wanted to become more conscientious across all of these different situations, I would have to make sure that my phone doesn't run out of battery. I would have to make sure that I do shopping more conscientiously. And now, if I manage to do that and fool someone, well, probably by that time, I've also become that person. So for me, this kind of distinction between what we call identity claims as psychologists, like these very explicit signals that we intentionally put out there, they're just complemented by all of these behavioral residue that we just leave and create without really thinking.
But there's not just a difference between what you're trying to communicate and who you really are, but there's a difference between who you aspire to be and who you actually are. I had some students who came up with an idea in my data class a couple of years ago for a dating app that tapped into your credit card and your fitness tracker and your location and all this stuff, so that if you said, "Oh, I love to exercise," it would say, "No, you don't like to exercise."
You might want to be that person who is.
Like, I like the arts. It's like, well, you
Yeah.
haven't been to the, museum in 10 years, right? So it would,
It's so funny because it very much depends on the context on how useful that information is, right? If this is in the context of a job interview or dating, you want to get to know the true person, right? So you want to know, is that person actually interested in exercising? Is that person actually conscientious? There's many other contexts where the person, knowing who that person is aspiring to be is actually as helpful, right? If you think about marketing, what you're trying to do is figure out, okay, what are they hoping to accomplish? So in that case, the ideal self is actually part of the profile that you're trying to create and the part of the profile that you're catering to. So in this case, it very much depends on, are you interested in the actual self, which is true in the context of jobs, or are you interested in the ideal self, which oftentimes is more valuable almost in the context of marketing?
Yeah, last week I was showing this video in my class, this little clip. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on these Australian comedians where they had this guy goes into the TikTok office and he says, I have a complaint about the algorithm because, you keep showing me these pictures of dancing ladies. And the algorithm says, yeah, what's the problem? He says, I don't want to see the dancing ladies. He says, well, it says right here that you do, and
Yes.
so,
And that's exactly, but also that to me, it's like it's a really important topic, because when we talk about these algorithms, and I'm guilty of that myself, it always seems like, well, yeah, if they can predict your personality with a high accuracy, that makes sense, but it still makes mistakes, right? So accuracy is always captured at the average level. So on average, we kind of get it right most of the time, but there still means that at the individual level, we make a lot of mistakes. And those mistakes can be really costly, can be costly for the individual, right? Because now you're seeing stuff that is completely irrelevant. Also costly for companies, because now you're optimizing for something that's not actually true. So I think if you can really think about application, I think the more you can turn this into a two-way street and conversation, the same way that this works in an offline world, right? If you kind of suddenly start kind of talking to me about topics that I care nothing about, you're going to get that feedback, because either I'm not going to see you again, or I just tell you, could we just talk about something else? And companies oftentimes don't get that because they don't allow users to interact with some of the predictions that they make. And I think it's a mistake, not just from an ethical point of view, but even from a kind of service, convenience, product point of view.
yeah, I remember when Netflix used to ask you to manually rate the movies that you watched, right? Back when it was DVDs. And now, of course, they don't ask you because they just track how long you watched the movie or how many times you watched the movie. So do you think that they're giving something up by not asking you? I mean, couldn't they combine your subjective rating with your behavioral data? Maybe would that be something that would be richer, would have more predictive value?
I agree. So, and I think some companies are doing this. So if I just scroll through my Instagram, for example, there's more and more companies, whether it's like recommending fashion to you, or that actually kind of place more emphasis on the user input, and they use it as a distinguishing factor, right? As a competitive advantage of like, we're not just kind of making predictions about you, we're involving you in the process of like almost like a discovery process, that we kind of go through together. And it's very clear, here's the value proposition, here's what you're getting out of it. And we're kind of involving you in going. So I agree that, will most people use it all the time? Probably not. But do I think it should be an option, either at the level of I'm telling you more about my preferences, or you just kind of reflecting back what you believe to be true about people, right? So if I don't want to go through like the clicking here and there, which movies that I like, Netflix could just come, here's what I believe, the type of person you are now. Like, you can play around with it. Right? If I predict that you're really excited about these kind of aesthetically pleasing, somewhat out there movies, as opposed to like the classic ones that you see in the cinema, here's like, you move the slider. You tell me kind of where you are. This is just a prediction that I make, but I want you to have access to it. And I also want you to be able to engage with it and change it if you disagree.
Now, you talk about the bright side and the dark side. It seems like when it comes to consumer goods, people are emphasizing the bright side a little more, right? Where you're aligning people's preferences with their options and so forth. But when it comes to things like politics, for some reason, we view this very differently, and we emphasize the dark side. But I mean, isn't choosing a politician just like choosing soap? I mean, like my friend Amy
Maybe
Gershoff,
not quite.
these folks in the Obama campaign realized that you're selling soap. Let's use all the tools that are being used to sell soap.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the stakes are higher, right? So I think, first of all, like if you think about the outcome, if I get it wrong in selling you some soap, who cares? If I get it wrong in terms of trying to figure out what you care about in a political space and maybe influence the outcome of an entire election, I think that's one of the distinguishing factors. And the other one, which I think is actually, Obama is like such a great example, because the reason for why Cambridge Analytica felt so intrusive and bad was, I think, first of all, people understood what does it mean that that much data about us is out there? Because if it's just about individual data points, we don't think of it as intrusive. If I tell you it's telling me whether you're impulsive, neurotic, that suddenly feels more intimate, even though it's actually, as we talked about before, kind of less complex than all of the data being out there. And then it's also like very much of a question of like, what is it being used for? If you think about what made Cambridge Analytica so unethical, it was not that it was trying to predict people's values. They were not trying to support the points of view that Trump was making. What they were trying to do is undermine the democratic process by saying, we want you to not go out and put your vote in for Hillary Clinton. Because I do believe, and like this, I don't have a strong opinion on whether we should actually be doing this or not. So I should say this ahead of time. But like at least theoretically, there is an argument to be made that says, well, the democracy is only as strong as participation of the people. And if 40% of Americans don't even bother to go out on election day, we're not really living in a real democracy. Why don't they go out? Because nobody took the time to sit down and explain to them why it matters. Like ideally, the politicians would go from door to door. Right? Ideally, Obama goes to every single door in the US, sits down, has a conversation of like, what are the topics that you care about? And let me explain to you how my party is addressing them, or as I, as a president, would be tackling those problems. Obviously, nobody has the time. And even with the extended workforce that we have with campaign, like support team, right? There's no way. And most of the time, it's not equally distributed. There's certain counties, certain states that matter a lot more, and a lot of focus is placed on those counties. So you could imagine an AI and psychological targeting, any type of understanding, could actually engage people in a dialogue that says, okay, I just really want to understand what are some of your pain points. Let me understand what you care about. Is it immigration? Is it gun laws? Is it whatever? Where are you coming from, and what is my response based on the policies that we have? And there's actually a lot of research now showing that you can change people's beliefs and conspiracy theories if you have an AI that engages in this dialogue, right? Kind of takes the time to sit down and maybe look at it from a different angle. So there's also this tremendous opportunity that we could actually use some of these AI tools to make the political process more engaging and also more inclusive for people who don't have Obama knocking on their door. But obviously, also a pretty big risk if you think about the flip side. It's like you're not trying to help people understand. You're just trying to kind of manipulate them and shift opinions in a way that benefits your own party.
Yeah, I mean, is your view of targeting influenced? I mean, is it impacted by, I guess, your view of preferences, right? Because I guess if you thought, people's preferences were stable, then all you could do with targeting is just, identify a match between their preference and some option, right? But if their personalities are fixed, but their preferences are fluid, then it seems more manipulative, right? Where you're actually, they don't have this. They're not starting off with a preference. They're starting off kind of, I don't know exactly how I'm supposed to manifest this personality with a choice, and lo and behold, we show up and tell you exactly how to do that. I mean,
sometimes it could also have essentially the idea of like you becoming more informed, right? If I understand here's something that you generally might care about, but you haven't made up your mind, how do I actually point you to different arguments, to different perspectives? I mean, in any political campaign, it's very hard to see how the other side would, like one side would make an argument for the policies of the other side. But if you think of an independent AI, that could just say, okay, you want to learn more about different arguments for and against immigration? Here's like those arguments. Or just ask me the question, what would someone who kind of takes a different perspective on this, what would they say? And in that case, it's like, it's instead of making us narrow, it would actually potentially broaden the perspective that we have on the world. Now, again, most people would probably not use that all too often just because it's very comfortable in our little echo chamber, but I at least kind of want to have the option out there. And then you could also argue that for the same policy, there's different angles to like why it matters, right? If I think about like, how do I craft an argument for why immigration is important? I can do this at an economic level. I can just kind of say, here's why it benefits you. So this is like a very self-focused. I can make it an argument that's much more communal and much more outward facing, like caring, right? So we want people to support, we want to be that nation the same way that you came as an immigrant at some point. We also want to make sure that the door is open for other people to have the same opportunity. So even for like the same policy, you can also oftentimes craft it or kind of find different angles to explain why it matters. And that I don't think actually of as manipulation, because it's true, right? The world is not black and white. There's many different reasons for why a certain action could be beneficial for different people, if you think about it in the political space.
I mean, do people's attitudes towards targeting basically depend on the degree to which they trust the targeter? I mean, you think about various health interventions, right? If your doctor's, sending you a message that's designed to make you adopt healthy habits, I don't think that most people would be terribly upset if they found out that appeal was, precision targeted towards their personalities. But if it's a casino that's trying to get you to come, then you're going to think very differently.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, the question is, are you essentially trying to help people move in the direction that they want to go in anyway, and maybe just having a hard time, right? In political spaces, you want to get involved, but it's hard and you don't have the time to now dive into all of these topics. In the health spaces, yeah, I do want to exercise more and eat more healthily, but it's really freaking difficult. In financial context, like we do want to save more, but again, this is something that's really hard to do for the human brain. So if you use psychological targeting in a way that gets me closer to my goal, I think most people would not only allow you to do that, but maybe even appreciate a little bit of liberal paternalism, right? So even if you've not actively sought out that support, I think a lot of people would say, no, it's like generally speaking, this seems to be something that we as society agree on is actually important. And kind of let's try to make that happen. From a company perspective, I think that there's two kind of tests that I like for companies to think about whether a specific use case might be borderline unethical or totally unethical, or actually beneficial to consumers. If you think about, like, if you were on the other side, right, you might be developing a product. If you were on the other side, or someone that you really love, take your kids, which I think is the one group that we want to protect the most. If your kid was on the other side, on the receiving end of your product, how would you feel about that? If that feels icky, maybe it's like crossing a line. Or there's Warren Buffett's newspaper test, which is like has a similar thought experiment. It's like, if your company tomorrow was exposed using data in a certain way on the front page of a local newspaper, so a newspaper that is read by the community of people that you care about, would you feel ashamed? And if you would feel ashamed, maybe you should be changing the practices, right? So I think for me, it's very much, are you trying to help people accomplish what they're hoping to accomplish, but just have a hard time with? Or are you trying to derail them from the path that you're on just because it benefits you?
Well, I mean, I think your research has demonstrated the efficacy of these precision targeting methods, but other people have said that a lot of this is, digital snake oil or digital phrenology, right? I mean, I think you see this mostly in the employment context, right? So a lot of people are very suspicious of personality tests, when you're applying for a job. But I mean, it would seem like in that context, it would be even more important that you get it right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it very much depends on how you use it. But so the reason for why I think people are skeptical about personality tests in the context of hiring is that there used to be this kind of consensus that there's certain personality traits that are desirable to have in the workplace. We want people who are conscientious. We want people who are emotionally stable. And there's one and only one profile that is actually successful across the board. And in that context, I actually agree that it's really problematic because you're sorting out part of the population who doesn't have the same access to jobs in the workforce. But there's also other ways in which you can think of it's almost like the dating analogy, right? So if we assume that everybody has certain skills and certain tendencies to behave in the world, why don't we try and focus, instead of like trying to mold you into a job, Because we know that people can act out of character, right? If I'm extremely introverted and you put me in a sales role, can I do it? Yeah, probably I can do it. Am I going to enjoy it? Probably not that much. The same is true in the opposite direction. If you have um, a someone who's extremely extroverted and you now give them a computer science job where they don't see people for the next 2 weeks, which is stereotypical, not even true. But if they can put them in a job where they don't have any social interactions, can they do it? Yes. But is it very enjoyable? Probably not. So for me, it's really this question of like, instead of assuming that there's one size fits all in terms of personality, the way that we've traditionally been using it a lot, and instead saying, I want to understand what is a good job for you, and I help you figure out roles, specific jobs that actually map onto that profile, is a totally different world. And I think in that case, most people would actually agree that it makes the search broader, because the way, and I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been involved for the last 7 years in like a startup that's essentially trying to accomplish exactly that. And it allows you to broaden your perspective away from your typical indicators, which is CV, right? Is like, which school did you go to? Is the school that you went to, is that a good school? And do I want to hire you based on that? What is your major? Did you major in computer science or engineering? That's great. And so once you abstract away from that and you see, here's the general tendencies, the general skills that can translate from one context to another, you actually enable people to have a lot more opportunities than they had before. So I think it's a question of like, how do you implement it?
Yeah. So, I mean, all the tools that have been used in marketing have been moved over to HR, right? Whether it's, whether it's targeting or, looking at customer acquisition cost, lifetime value, churn, all that kind of stuff. But the main difference, I think, what you're saying is that in the employment context, it's a lot harder to customize at a very granular level, right? The experience. And it's also the feedback cycle is going to be slower. So, you're not going to learn as quickly. And presumably, you're not going to invest a lot of resources looking for disconfirming evidence because the cost of a false positive is going to be very, very high. So
And
you
you
don't.
ought the stakes so much higher, right? So there's a reason for why in marketing, again, if I sell you the wrong toothpaste or I use the wrong, it's not the end of the world. If I kind of don't give you a job because my prediction of who you are is actually wrong, now that's a much bigger mistake to make, right? And the problem that we oftentimes have with these predictive models is that it's systematized. Same is true for personality inventories, by the way. It's like, yeah, we all used to have biases as humans, so there's always a bias baked into the process, but it varied a little bit, right? So maybe you kind of had a preference for extroverts, I had a preference for introverts. The moment that we kind of have one algorithm that makes decisions, it discriminates against the same type of people all the time, which is the problem number one. And the second problem is that if my prediction of who Greg is wrong, that just kind of the consequences of that are much bigger than just, yeah, you're now buying the wrong toothpaste. So I think this translation of marketing tools to HR makes sense in principle, but I would say that the quality assurance, the quality control that you want to go through in an HR context, and I'm sure that most people would agree with that, is just much, much higher than in marketing.
Well, I want to get back to a point you made earlier, which relates to the stability of personality characteristics. We all know about echo chambers and how they are reinforcing beliefs, let's say, right? Is this kind of targeting reinforcing personality types? I mean, to what extent are personality types flexible? To what extent can people, change them? Can they be changed? And would we expect the amount of change to kind of go down if people are just provided with things that line up nicely with their perceived personality profiles?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. First of all, the way that personality psychologists now think about personality traits has shifted quite a bit over the last, I would say, decade or two, in the sense that we don't necessarily think about it as these static point estimates anymore. So back in the day, kind of the typical psychological trait approach was to say, well, Greg is, say, 80% more extroverted than the average population, and we don't expect this to shift that much. The way that we think about it right now is both that it can shift across situations. So we now think of it as a distribution of extroversion states. So you have a certain mean and average, and that's your disposition, that's your tendency, right? So that might be the 80% more extroverted than average person. But depending on whether you're in a social context, right? If you're surrounded by friends in an exciting space, like at a party, you probably are even more extroverted than your 80%. Whereas if you're at home all by yourself and there's no stimulation whatsoever, you probably feel more introverted. So this kind of already allows to think of personality a lot more dynamically as this distribution of states. We also know that there's these normative personality developments over the lifespan. So people tend to become more agreeable, more conscientious, less neurotic, for example, over the years. So this is like a general shift of that distribution in a certain direction. For me, the interesting part of algorithms is my concern is that they squish our distribution. So if you kind of are 80% extroverted, but sometimes you're 60 and some point you're 90, that kind of gives you quite a bit of variance around that average, right? So it acknowledges that, yeah, depending on the situation, social influence, you kind of behave differently. My concern is that algorithms essentially squish that to say, I'm going to optimize for your general tendency. And now I'm just going to show you content around that. And that's just going to make you more and more boring over time. So it's a nice way in which I think the advanced personality frameworks actually help us understand both development over time, but also the potential impact of these algorithms.
Yeah, I wonder if in the broader culture we are expecting, right, more kind of catering to our personality profiles. I know in business school, part of the reason why you go to business school, I think, is because you want to become more extroverted. At least that was my belief. That was my experience in business school, was that I became more extroverted. But I've recently had experiences in my class where, if I cold call on someone, they say, "Hey, look, I'm introverted, so you shouldn't cold call on me." And it's like, well, don't you want to be extroverted? It's like, no, like I'm introverted and I plan on staying that way forever. I'm wondering if that's like a byproduct of the kind of, targeting that everyone is exposed to.
It's a great question. I don't know if it's a function of the technology, but it's so interesting because that specific example, right? So I mean, I guess my response to that would have been like, I understand that you're introverted, but we still want to hear your opinion, right? If you like what you're trying to accomplish in business school, again, the goal that you're trying to accomplish is to have your voice heard within an organization. And the lowest hanging fruit of kind of feeling comfortable with that in the moment that it matters is practicing in a context that is similar to this classroom, right? So even though I don't need you to become an extrovert, what I want you to do is to get the skills that when the situation requires you, you can actually move from your center point of the distribution to something that feels a little bit more extroverted. So that it almost kind of feels like you're widening the distribution by giving people these different experiences and making them feel somewhat more comfortable, at least momentarily breaking out. So what we know is that if you force people to constantly break out, but if you have a real introvert and you put them in a sales role, that actually takes a tax. So that is bad for your physical and mental health. But just kind of momentarily trying to break out and kind of becoming a little bit wider, I think is like what university and schools are made for.
hmm Well, I want to get back to your original metaphor of the village. And when we all lived in small communities, everybody knew our business, right? Everybody was up in our business, and our front doors were open, and people wandered in and out, and everyone was gossiping about you. And now we're back, but it's much larger. The scale is bigger. And the people who know everything about us are sitting in Silicon Valley. They're not sitting across the street. So, I mean, to what extent is that the same? And to what extent is that different? And to what extent is it less worrisome? And to what extent is it more worrisome?
I mean, generally speaking, I think it's more worrisome, mostly because there's an imbalance. So back in the village, we kind of went through similar processes. So we kind of tried to understand who's on the other side by observing behavior and then oftentimes also influence behavior of the people around us, but it's very bidirectional. So I grew up in this tiny village and I used to be influenced, but I also try to influence the people around me, right? So we both gather intelligence and we both try to exercise the power that comes with intelligence. Now it's like totally tilted playing field. So there's a few players who have access to a lot of data and access to the minds and hearts, if you want, of millions of people. And that's a totally different playing field in the sense that not only is it not reciprocal, but also the impact, the potential impact that you have when you're Facebook and you can shape the views and perspectives of millions of people with just a few clicks, that's just totally different. So I think for me that the main question that I've been kind of asking myself is like, how do we make it work for the people who actually generate the data, in the sense that if we believe that there's these real opportunities, right? We talked about how data can actually be extremely valuable, the same way that it was valuable in the village that someone knew my preferences and my desires, because they could then help me find the right internship, help me figure out what I want to do after school. So if we believe that there's true value in understanding people, then the question becomes, how do you amplify that value while mitigating the risk of like privacy and self-determination, you name it? And I think there are a couple of ways. For me, the most important one that not enough people are talking about is, how do you break this dichotomy in people's minds? That is, you can either have convenience and service and great products, Google Maps that gets you from A to B, Siri that listens, Alexa. Like, how do you get that? You maintain it or maybe even amplify, but you don't have to trust data to keep all of the data. And there are now technologies that allow you to train models locally, right? So if you take Apple, for example, the way that they typically train Siri is, instead of you submitting all of your speech data to Apple's central server where they can process and they can update their models and make them better, they send their intelligence to your phone. So your phone is a supercomputer in your pocket. So what they can do is they can just send a model to your phone. It learns how you speak with your data being processed locally. So now your Siri gets better, right? It understands you better. And the model can still send back the intelligence. So it can still tell Apple, okay, here's how you should tweak the model, but your data never leaves the phone. And for me, that's one of these ways in which, like, an option that I didn't have in the village, right? In the village, either I got the benefit in the service and convenience, but then also people had to know stuff about me. I couldn't just give them the data for a second, process it, and then delete it again. It was just like, it was there. But now in this current world, that's on the one hand more tilted, but we also have these new technologies that actually alleviate some of the trade-offs that we traditionally had to make in the village. And that's like an exciting part for me.
So, I mean, do we need default rules? Because it seems like whenever people get shocked by things like Cambridge Analytica, they, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're doing this. But then 5 minutes later, somebody comes along and asks them for the same data in exchange for a slice of pizza, and they hand it on over, right? So, I mean,
Who
what,
wouldn't
what
want to
is
have a slice of pizza? Yes.
yeah, I mean, right now, like 23andMe, I know everybody's trying to pull their data off because they don't know what it's going to be used for. But I mean, there it's like, okay, I get to find out where my ancestors came from, and in exchange for that, I'm going to hand over all my, my DNA. Is it just because people are ignorant? Is it short? Is it because they have high discount rates? Is it informed consent doesn't seem to make any kind of difference.
It's not informed, right? So the way that we typically sign away data is we consent, but not because we understand it. And I think there's some of it is just that, like, technology moves so fast that just keeping up with technology is almost impossible. So I think about this 24/7, and I have a hard time. And you also have to have this understanding of, like, not just in the here and now, like, what are right, like a fully rational person would say, here's all the benefits and here's all the downsides. And now I kind of make this rational decision that kind of maximizes utility. But we don't understand the downsides. It's very clear what the upside is. Like, we get the product in the here and now. Maybe we get the slice of pizza. We don't understand what the downside is in the here and now and in the future. Like, 23andMe example is a perfect example, because yeah, maybe you benefited here and now, but you then don't know if your data is going to be sold on to a third party that does something totally different with it. And I think even if you were to somehow magically keep up with the latest tech and fully think this through, we don't have the time. Right? Nobody has the time for all of the services and products that they're using to now carefully read through the terms and conditions, really figure out, is the you giving away your data, is it really worth it? And so I think if we're left to our own devices, I don't think we stand a chance. And I see this with myself. So I care a lot about this topic. I care a lot about the dark side and the privacy aspect. And I do a terrible job. Right. So there's like I want to get to a website, but then the kid is crying and I quickly accept all of the cookies. Or I want to use a product and certainly don't read the terms and conditions because I have other stuff to do. So if it left to our own devices, and the trade-off is, as you said, I can either quickly consent without really understanding, but they get the benefits. Everybody's going to go for the benefits. So kind of the idea of defaults, I think, is a really important one, because if we shifted the default, your data is protected by default. And now the company actually has to really do their job at convincing me that the way that they offer the product and service is so much better by using my data than anything that I could get otherwise. Totally different, right? And then we're using the laziness and the fact that we're somewhat constrained with our time to our benefit, and not just a benefit for companies.
Now, you offered this proposal of these data co-ops, and I'm having trouble understanding that, because it seems like you just displaced the same problem with monitoring, right? I mean, if the data co-ops had a fiduciary duty to you, I mean, couldn't you just sort of put the fiduciary duty on Facebook, let's say, or on LinkedIn? I mean, you'd still be faced with this monitoring problem, right?
I think it's just never going to happen. I don't think Facebook will ever have a fiduciary responsibility to you. And it's like you'd also have to do this across all of the products and services that you're using. So the idea that a data co-op, as one of your representatives, can have these conversations with different companies and also build the expertise, right? So data co-ops, because it's like there's many people coming together, you oftentimes have a lot more resources to hire experts who understand the space. What are some of the implications? What are some of the downsides? What are some of the risks? They are also the ones who can then push for technologies like federated learning, where you don't have to collect the data in a central spot. So they could be the ones saying, well, instead of, like, we facilitate the Siri model, where the company just sends the intelligence to my phone, for all of the smaller companies that otherwise don't have the resources, right? There might be amazing startups in the mental health space or like a nutrition space that would benefit from the fact that they don't have to collect all of the data, but provide the same intelligence. They might not have the resources to build out that infrastructure. Once you have a data corp who's kind of tasked with acting in consumers' best interest, they might be able to support some of that building out of the infrastructure.
Now, last question. You know, these marketing algorithms are much better at predicting human behavior and personality traits than we are as humans, using our carbon-based processors. And this means that we might be able to get, better therapists, better advisors, and maybe even, better spouses. Right?
I doubt that, but
Well, you're starting to see the emergence of these, digital boyfriends and girlfriends that seem to adapt their conversation to suit the individual character. I mean, what are some of the pros and cons of these kind of personalized agents that people are using for things other than just, buying consumer goods and so forth?
I mean, I think the main one is that it typically democratizes access, right? If you think about the mental health space, there's still so many people around the world who suffer from mental health issues who don't have access to a blood and flesh therapist. So I think, according to the World Health Organization, for every 100,000 people looking for a therapist, there's 13 trained human professionals. And obviously those are not equally distributed. If you live on the Upper East Side, you're definitely going to find one. If you live in other parts of the world, you're probably going to have a hard time. So for me, these agents who can kind of simulate and mimic some of this kind of emotional conversation that we have as humans, it's just kind of extremely helpful for people who don't have access to a blood and flesh therapist, for example. Now, one of the concerns that I have, and you mentioned the context of relationships, is that we're almost losing the ability to deal with a messy reality. Right. So you said, like, human relationships are complicated. We don't always want the same thing. I don't always agree with your opinion. And I think our generation still has gone through the process of learning how to deal with that. Like, what I'm concerned about is my 1-year-old who might grow up in a world where they just interact with artificial agents that constantly agree with everything. How is he going to be able to have a real conversation with a future girlfriend or boyfriend who just disagrees, right? It's like, it feels uncomfortable in the moment, but you live through the pain, and that's how you grow as individuals. And I think for me, that part is the scarier one, that I don't want us to lose that ability to deal with complexity and messiness.
Maybe you could just have your agent interact with their agent and solve
Yes.
problems.
Yeah,
The other
you're
thing I
going to
think
eat the broccoli, little kiddo. That's
yeah,
the
thing I would be concerned about, though, is these therapists, right, get hijacked by, say, pharmaceutical companies or other folks who are, trying to market products. And they would, once they got into the inner recesses of people's struggles and so forth, they'd be in a better position to sell these products.
I mean, many different concerns on that front, but yeah, that's certainly one.
Sandra, thanks so much for joining me. The book Mindmasters, it's fantastic. It reviews this literature in some depth and very, very provocative. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much. Fun conversation.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.